All right, welcome everyone. My name is Kathleen Calderon. I am a graduate research assistant for the Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies at USC. Joining us is Dr. Juan de Lara, director of the center. Our center brings together faculty, students, and community partners to engage in interdisciplinary research and public-facing scholarship that focuses on Latinx communities within the United States and in Latin America. We celebrate the diversity of Latinx and Latin American communities while engaging in scholarship that addresses important social and economic issues. Our hemispheric approach necessitates a mode of research that crosses many borders, cultural, political, and disciplinary, as do the people of the Americas. Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge that USC is located on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Tongva Gabrielino people. We honor their past, present, and future generations. I now want to introduce our moderator, Dr. Reighan Gillam, researches the ways in which subjects experience, negotiate, and challenge stereotypical and controlling images. She examines these issues through the lens of Afro-Brazilian media producers in southeastern Brazil. She is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Visualizing Black Lives to understand how Afro-Brazilians turn to their racialized experiences as a source for visual content and the kinds of images they generate. And now to our presenter, Dr. Maurice Rafael Magaña, who is a sociocultural anthropologist whose research focuses on the cultural politics of youth organizing, transnational migration, urban space, and social movements in Mexico and the United States. Dr. Magaña's first book, titled Cartographies of Youth Resistance, Hip Hop, Punk, and Urban Autonomy in Mexico, was published by the University of California Press in 2020. Thank you both for your presence today, and thank you, Dr. Gillam, for moderating our discussion. I'm excited to share this space with you and with the audience as well, and I look forward to engaging with you in the later portion of the Q&A. So with that, I pass it on to y'all.
Okay, thank you so much, Kathleen, for the introductions, and Juan for the invitation, Reighan for accepting my invitation to join me in conversation. I'm really a fan of your work, and I'm excited to see what kind of conversation we have. Hopefully, bringing your insights and your expertise into conversation with what I think, is a good, interesting overlap between our work. And so thank you also to everybody who is joining us, to all the audience members. And I think I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Gillam.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be in conversation. Thank you to Kathleen as well, Kathleen Calderon, for all the work that you put into the event. And thank you to Juan de Lara and the Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies. So my first question for you, Maurice, about your book is, well, first I should say that Maurice and I will talk about his book for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience for the last part of the discussion for about 15 minutes. So so as we're going, people can put their questions into the chat. And I think there's also a way in which people can possibly raise their hand and ask their question. So we'll look forward to that after I asked Maurice these questions. So my first question was, how did you come to this project? You mentioned in the book focuses on two sort of major groups of actors. You have the teachers union, and then you have the youth activists who you focus on, and they're both engaged in the social movement and these series of like activist movements. And you mentioned in the book that at a certain point you switched from focusing on the teachers to focusing on the activists, and so I wondered just generally what brought you to this topic of resistance and social movements in Oaxaca.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that question. And yeah, that's absolutely true. That the sort of the way that the project started was much more focusing on the teachers union, and then it shifted to focus on youth activists. But a general sort of interest in social movements and resistance in Oaxaca really came from a broader interest in social movements in Mexico that I think my father was a student activist in the 1968 UNAM movement in Mexico, the National Autonomous University of Mexico movement in 1968 that sort of had its infamous moment in the Tlatelolco massacre. And so, I grew up with sort of stories about that movement and about that era of activism and of social movements. But then at the same time also, the repression that movement suffered really marked the way that my dad and really his generation, I think, understood both the potential but also the consequences and the limitations of activism. And so it really informed the way that my father, then being an immigrant in the United States, understood or didn't recognize the same kind of activism when there was the first invasion of Iraq and the Gulf War and other moments that he really expected a certain kind of student-led movement to emerge that he didn't necessarily see. And so he would a lot of times kind of like throw that back on me and ask me, like, what's going on? Like, what is it with your generation, and why aren't you all doing more? But then at the same time, he would also be like, but at the same time, the government will kill you. So also, so it's kind of this tension. And so that was always, something that that we talked about in my household. And then with the Zapatista movement emerging in 1994, my dad was a big believer, a big sympathizer of the Zapatista movement, and would read a lot of books about the Zapatistas and by the Zapatistas, and then I would get some of that through him. And so really, when I decided that I was going to go to graduate school, I had that interest to know more about social movements in Mexico. And so that was my general sort of interest. And I did some human rights observation type work in Chiapas, in Zapatista communities. And so I thought that when I went to grad school that I was going to continue to work in that area. But then the summer before I started grad school, the movement emerged in Oaxaca in the summer of 2006. And my advisor, Lynn Stephen, who had written about the Zapatistas, which is how I came to apply to the program at the University of Oregon in anthropology and want to work with her, was because of the work she did with the Zapatistas. But she actually had a much longer history of working in Oaxaca. And so she was in Oaxaca when everything was happening, and I was just about to start the program. And we had several conversations, and it just really all signs pointed to this being a really important movement, a really important moment for social movements in Oaxaca. And so then that's how my attention went to Oaxaca as opposed to where I thought I was going to be working. And then maybe later in the conversation, I'm not sure, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the shift from the teachers to the youth, but in general, that's where the interest in social movements in Mexico and Oaxaca came from.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so I wanted to I guess, next move to the larger argument for the book, because you really present, a powerful intervention into our understandings of social movements, in that the book, reconsiders how we think about, as you say, space and temporality in relationship to protest. And so, what we usually think about social movements as maybe like a direct action, like people marching in the street or an occupation or a sit-in. So we think about that moment, but and one wonders, so when people aren't sitting in or marching, like where does it go? What happens? And so you kind of are talking about this, the ephemerality of the energy of the social movement. And you redirect our gazes to these counter spaces, and you ask how this energy is sustained during the ebb and flow of protests in spaces that might be more hidden from our view. And so, as you just said, the book starts with this 2006 protest and follows the ways in which youth activists maintain this energy, year after year. And so I wondered how you came to these larger insights that you present to us in the book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I guess that's a good way to sort of also bring in, the question that I left a little bit unanswered from the previous question about the shift from the teachers to the youth activists. So when I first started doing field work in Oaxaca around this movement, I guess there was two sort of assumptions that I made based on the narratives that were circulating about the movement, both in the media as well as the sort of early kinds of analysis that was coming out about it. So it was that the movement ended in late 2006 after the federal police came in and retook physical control of the city. So the social movement in 2006 was this really amazing sort of grassroots takeover of the capital city of Oaxaca that started with a teachers union encampment in the central plaza of the city. And then the governor ordered the police to evict the teachers, in the middle of the night and in a very violent eviction, and then it immediately backfired, and lots of people, both sympathizers of the teachers and other people who wouldn't have otherwise been sympathetic to the teachers, but were really just outraged by the use of force and the real indiscriminate, tear gassing in the middle of the city and all this kind of thing. And so it turned into this really, massive show of popular power and outrage that they drove the police back to their barracks and sort of joined the teachers, retook the central plaza. And then from there, it just really snowballed into this massive movement with the teachers really as a central, pillar of the movement. But then when the federal police came in about 6 months later and retook control of the city, then people basically declared the movement was over because they lost physical control of the city. And so I came in thinking I was going to study something that happened in the past that no longer was, and really focused on the teachers. And so my master's thesis did focus on the alliances that the teachers made with other more traditional, like civil society organizations and unions and things like that, that allowed the movement to really coalesce and get as large as it did. But what became very clear to me was, there was kind of two things that became clear to me as I was doing that research. One was that the movement wasn't over for many of the people who participated in the grassroots takeover, right? They still talked about it in the present. They didn't talk about it in the past. They continued to mobilize. They continued to, to organize. And for them, the movement wasn't over. It was simply in a different phase of the movement. And so then that's where sort of my questioning and kind of grappling of, the temporality of movements and how do we assess, movement success or failure, or are those even the right questions? So those kinds of questions came out of that. But then the focus on the youth really came from what a lot of my interlocutors were telling me when they would remember, what was so impactful for them about the movement many times was seeing all of these young people really just step up and form, the front lines of keeping, older folks safe from repression, and also the creative ways that they organized and the artwork that they contributed, and just really novel kinds of spaces that they helped create. And so it became clear that the youth were really a really important part of this movement, but since they didn't belong to, traditional formal kinds of civil society or opposition politics organizations, they were often written out of the story, or were simply, kind of a footnote of like, oh yes, there is a lot of street art, in the movement, but that was kind of it. And so then I started to be more interested in, well, who were these, youth who participated? How are they now continuing to mobilize or not? And so then that's where that focus came. And then, those questions just kept getting louder and louder the more time I spent in Oaxaca, and the further away we got from the supposed end of the movement. And it just was more and more clear that this movement for many was still not over. And so then that's, those questions really needed to be addressed the more that I kind of got involved in the research project.
Yeah, thank you. That was interesting in talking about your dad and these generational understandings of activism, and then you talking about the teachers looking at taking a new view of young people and seeing them in the movement, now, because you bring this up in the book, how you kind of ask us to reconsider how young people are being characterized, and particularly in the case of Oaxaca. And the young people that you focus on are called ninis. They're neither working nor studying. And so, it seems like, and they're really into punk music, as you say, and hip hop, and they identify as Indigenous people. And it might appear that they're being unproductive, but rather than like thinking about this, they're actually like propelling the movement. They're producing the movement in these counter spaces. And there was one of your interlocutors who had this quote, and her quote was about the garden that they were growing in one of these spaces. And she said, "We all eat, but if the revolution is successful, who will feed us?" And I was just so taken by that quote. And so my question for you is, so what were young people doing in these counter spaces to harness the social movement energy? And like, what were they doing there to to feed their revolutionary imaginations?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and really, I think captures a lot of the, the essence of this network of youth activists, the ways that they understood sort of the importance of the movement and their participation in it, and what it was that they're fighting for. And so some of these counter spaces, to give folks an idea, are youth-run social centers. They're they're urban farms. They're street art galleries. They're workshops for making bicycle-powered appliances. What they share, in addition to the experience of being run by people who came of political age during that 6 months of grassroots control, the city is really a commitment to non-hierarchical horizontal organizing, to a prefigurative politics where what matters is not just sort of a goal like somewhere in the future, but it's actually what you do in the present, how you relate to one another, how you imagine a more just society through the ways that you relate to people, to people's labor, their skills, how you value those, how you engage in economic transactions that are not sort of reproducing the capitalist economy. So how do you create alternative economies based on bartering and use value? How do you relate to the earth? How do you grow food to feed yourselves and your neighbors and your families? How do you bridge sort of this divide between the urban and the rural? So a lot of the young people are migrants from rural, often indigenous communities. Sometimes they go back and forth. Sometimes they're a generation or two removed. But there's this very intentional sort of how do you bridge those divides? How do you stay in relation with these communities that you come from? How do you build collective autonomy, right? So how do you collect struggle? How do you connect struggles? So going and really being very intentional about fostering exchanges with other communities that are in struggle as well. So you learn from one another. So you feed each other's movements. And so it's this real, intentional, not so glamorous sort of work of everyday organizing that really feeds the radical imagination of this network of collectives, and that then informs how they respond when there are those ebbs, right, in movement activity, when there's sort of an event or something that needs to be responded to. It's not like people are being sort of summoned from all these disparate individualized realities, right? They're always trying to find these hubs and these these ways of keeping the movement alive every day and across space. And so then they're sort of they come together to mobilize when it's needed, and then they kind of go back and do that everyday organizing that keeps it going, right?
Yeah, this is fascinating. So in the book, you hold, as you just said, this intention, the relationship between the ephemeral energy of the social movements and then the concrete spaces of the youth centers and the urban walls like throughout the city. And you have this idea of rebel aesthetics, and I'm gonna quote you. You write, rebel aesthetics are the collective practices through which activists and artists give visual form to their utopian visions and sensibilities. And you have this image of Benito Juarez punk in the book. I have it here to hold it up. And the purveyor of the image said he got the image from somewhere else, and that so it wasn't necessarily original. And that was interesting to me because I'd met someone in Brazil who did a similar thing, and I was interviewing him about this image, and he put it on a t-shirt, and I said, "Oh, how did you come up with this?" And I'm expecting the story of creativity, and he said, "Oh no, I just got it from this other person," and then I did all these things with it. And so I was just fascinated with this image, and And it, you know, reminded me of like sampling and hip hop, which, you know, some of your interlocutors were into. They trouble these ideas of ownership. And so as you just mentioned, they were, you know, producing graffiti and and you have this idea of rebel aesthetics. So how was the social movement playing out in these, on the walls of Oaxaca as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating that you have that sort of parallel, you know, experience, and I think it speaks to. I mean, I'm not sure the context that you're, you know, that you came to that interaction through, but in the case of, you know, of the rebel aesthetics that I talk about, you know, it's really this like an emphasis not on, you know, ownership or, you know, individual sort of credit for, you know, creative authenticity. It's really about tapping into this collective, this sort of collective counter history, right? Of like, what does it mean to be Oaxacan, right? Or what does it mean to be proud of being Oaxacan, as opposed to, you know, any of the other identities that these young people share. And for a state that really has, you know, is really marketed, you know, through its folklore and through sort of a lot of more marketable aspects of it, you know. Benito Juárez punk, you know, Benito Juárez, the first indigenous, the first and only, right, indigenous president of Mexico, being from Oaxaca. That's something that, you know, is often, you know, sort of this point of pride. But they're trying to kind of make it more subversive, right, and make it to really be this point of source of a rebellious sort of spirit, right? And so they do that with Benito Juárez, but some of them actually take issue with Benito Juárez because of his more liberal, you know, kind of politics. And so they reclaim Ricardo Flores Magón, who is also from Oaxaca and, you know, is an anarchist revolutionary in the Mexican Revolution. And so they kind of give him the same treatment and give him the punk, you know, hairstyle and everything. And so it's their ways of sort of reclaiming what it means, you know, to be Oaxacan, or to be proud of it, right, and kind of take it away from the state. But then also to go back to your question about what this looked like on the walls, you know, a really interesting thing that a practice that sort of emerges, you know, from the movement is really the participation of graffiti artists and other kinds of like post-graffiti street artists in mobilizations where they're painting, you know, they're protected from policing and surveillance to paint on the walls in the context of a march or a rally. And so they put up some really elaborate pieces in addition to slogans and things like that that are more quickly reproduced, but they have now come to sort of take a mobilization as an opportunity to put up that illicit piece that you wanted to put up that, you know, is critical of the government in a real central place of the city that you otherwise don't have access to, right? And so there's sort of these afterlives of marches and rallies and mobilizations that they leave behind, where you can kind of follow the route of the march by just looking at the walls, right? Because they leave behind all these different visual sort of artifacts, right, of those mobilizations, everything from wheat paste, you know, sort of paste ups, posters, stencils, you know, freeform graffiti, and elaborate murals and things like that. And so that's become one of the sort of lasting kinds of visual manifestations of dissent in Oaxaca.
So if people want to put any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, feel free to do that. I have this question about, I guess, indigeneity, and you just mentioned that Benito Juarez was the first and only indigenous president of Mexico from Oaxaca. And so indigeneity in the book, it seems to be functioning differently, as you just said, from how the state would like it to. And it seems like the state is constantly trying to harness indigenous culture like to these national projects of like heritage tourism or these festivals. And I was particularly taken by the one festival where the state built a stadium for them to do the festival in, and then charging people money, which then would like exclude the very people who are producing the culture, right? And so the state is, doing that with like heritage tourism. And then they're also cracking down on the protests very strongly. It seems almost like warfare is going on. And of course, like the nation also might want to recognize indigeneity through like mestizaje, which, this national ideal of mixture, which would in a way like render it invisible. But then there's like this living indigenous culture that the people use as it seems to fuel their insurgency. And you even call, I think, Oaxaca like ungovernable, and that it's been ungovernable. And so I wondered, like, how do activists draw from this living indigeneity to organize themselves, and what practices do they draw from?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, that's a really important part of, I think, collective identities that these collectives are drawing on, and it's really this this urban indigeneity that I refer to at times as an insurgent indigeneity, right? Because there's sort of the ways that the state and anthropologists, right, as an anthropologist myself working in Oaxaca, being very aware of the ways that anthropology has been really in the service of the state in crafting these really essentialist top-down imposed notions of what it to be indigenous, right? On language, speaking an indigenous language, for example, or how you dress, right? If you wear, quote unquote traditional dress, whether it's your place of residence, right, where indigeneity becomes sort of geographically pinned in remote rural locations, and the cities are mestizo or white spaces, right? And so there's this insistence by this generation of urban young people who, again, are mostly migrants to the city from what would be mostly recognized as indigenous communities, that are saying we don't stop being indigenous because we moved to the city, or because we no longer speak an indigenous language, or because we dress as punks, or or whatnot, right? And so they redefine what it means to be indigenous, like very explicitly, in their political manifestos and the ways that they talk about their projects. They make it very clear that they're claiming indigeneity based on a history of collective struggle that they see as their legacy, that they're inheriting and they're continuing. And so being part of the movement that's not over, that's ongoing, is really important to them. They understand indigeneity as being based on social relations, right? Again, who they're accountable to, who they are in community with. They understand it on their politics, and and how they then understand their political sort of how do we translate the practices of communal governance and social organization that exist in our communities of origin, right? That's where understanding the context of Oaxaca is really important, because in Oaxaca today, the majority of municipalities are still governed not through electoral politics, but through usos y costumbres, which is like indigenous customary law. And so decisions are made through the communal assembly, and political positions are held through sort of a rotational voting system that's not based on political parties. It's based on who do you think would be the best to fill this position. And it's not a paid position. It's not a career position. It's you serve, you know, a certain amount of years at the position, and then you go back to what you were doing before. And so you're very much still part of the community. You're not a separate class of, you know, a politician. And so it's a whole nother way of doing politics and governance, right? It's a whole nother form of governance. And so that sort of model of a politics otherwise very much is front and center in their imaginations and in what they're trying to create, right? They're not trying to do a carbon copy. They understand it's a different context, this is a different situation, but it's very important sort of motivation and sort of like a guiding principle, right? And so, you know, part of that too is, as you mentioned, this idea of Oaxaca being ungovernable, right? That's something that they themselves are seeking to achieve and to continue, right? Is to make Oaxaca ungovernable. They understand that you know, there's indigenous groups like the Mijes in Oaxaca that call themselves los jamás conquistados, those who were never conquered, right? Because the Aztecs never conquered them, the Mixtecs never conquered them, the Zaptecs never conquered them, the Spanish never conquered them, and the Mexican state is not going to conquer them, right? And so this is something that even those you know, young people who are not themselves Mijes, they really admire that, and they want to recreate that. They want to make that be true, right? That we are ungovernable, we cannot be co-opted, we're, you know, anti-statist, anti-capitalist, activists, and that was also part of the 2006 movement. Was the one of the goals of the movement was to have the federal government declare Oaxaca ungovernable so that they would remove the governor from office, right? So that's also a political strategy, right? To make Oaxaca so ungovernable that the federal government would have no choice but to remove the governor. And so that's also a recurring sort of theme in the politics that the youth are practicing. And so I guess that's a very long-winded thing that for them, indigeneity is not based on, you know, biology or essentialist notions, right? But it's based on your politics and your social relations and who you're accountable to and how you enact your relationships and your politics.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Ungovernability as a strategy in a social movement too. That's amazing. There's some questions in the chat which I'll turn to. And I don't know if people want to say their question, but there's this question about the transnational aspects of creative aesthetics as a way of rebellion. So I wondered, do you have anything you would want to say about the transnational character of the activism or the social movements of the youth that you were looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that oh, I don't know if I see Amina Cruz. Did you want to add something to that?
Oh no, please go. That was just my question.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a great question, because there's quite a few ways, right, that both the movement, even though it was very much place-based and responding to local socio-political conditions, was still transnational. And one of the ways that it was national was in the ways that different communities supported the movement, right? Whether it was the Oaxacan diaspora in different parts of California or other parts of the country in the US, holding mobilizations in front of Mexican consulates to bring attention to the human rights abuses that were occurring, whether it was through the anarcho-punk networks that some of my interlocutors belong to, circulating materials from the movement to raise awareness and also collect funds and things like that to support political prisoners, for example, or whether it's through your question, right, that creative aesthetic, the visual aesthetic that emerged in Oaxaca is very particular to those collectives and to the movement, the collectives that came out of the movement, but they didn't emerge out of nowhere, right? There is a lot of if you kind of trace, as I try to do in the book, the genealogies of these collectives and of these graffiti crews and sort of where they got their start and where they got their inspiration, it's through a lot of times magazines that, that a family member sent from the US or that they found in Mexico City on a trip to Mexico City, or like the example of the Benito Juarez punk, that was actually an image that a artist in Oaxaca first saw in a punk magazine, where it was a photograph of a punk in Ciudad Juarez in the border state of Chihuahua, where I think it was not on their shirt. I think it was like maybe like a poster or something that they saw of Benito Juarez with a mohawk, right? And so then that sort of becomes this this new image that gets modified in some ways, but then becomes really emblematic of the movement, right? And so it's transnational in many ways, and both in its reverberations and in its influences and inspiration.
Thank you. There's another question here from Juan de Lara. Can you speak more about the way you locate anarchist politics within Oaxacan indigenous practices? I'm especially interested to hear how you try to decenter whiteness from anarchist ideas and practice like direct democracy and mutual aid.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's something that that I've been trying to think more about actually in work, is sort of thinking about this, these indigenous anarchisms or decolonial anarchisms, as in the book. That, again, this really comes from my interlocutors and the ways that they understand their politics, right? Ask questions like, do you identify, with any particular political ideology or political, philosophy? Do you consider yourselves anarchists? Do you consider yourself, this, that, or the other? And actually, it's the same young woman that spoke about feeding the revolution, Rosalia. She also you know, had come from her sort of political formation was really working in independent radio, which in Oaxaca has a very strong history, and it's very strong in indigenous communities, right? This history of having independent radios. And so she had that experience of working in these free radios or independent radios. And she had the opportunity to work with, you know, this really important Zapotec activist and intellectual Jaime Martinez Luna, who she quotes, right, when I asked her if she identifies as anarchist, and she's like, well, you know, Jaime Luna would say that if we're anarchists, it's not because of, you know, these Western philosophers, and it's not even because of, you know, Ricardo Flores Magón. She's like, if we're anarchists, it's because our practices in our communities are what anarchists are attempting to do, right? So they're like, we're proto, like our politics is more anarchist than what gets labeled anarchist, right? So they're like, yes, you know, you could say that we are anarchists, but it's not because of these Western theories of anarchist politics, right? And they do still read, right, those philosophers and are very aware of, you know, what might be more readily recognized as inspiration from what's useful for them, but they also locate that as being indigenous to their communities, right? And so I think that's really important, right? When we talk about anarchist politics, is to not whitewash them, because a lot of times when we do talk about anarchism, it's this global North white sort of tradition that gets conjured, right? Which is part of the story, but that's not the whole story. So I try to excavate some of these mutual aid and direct democracy, horizontal organization that you know are hallmarks of but that are actually indigenous to, right? And so that's a little bit about what that project for me was like, where that stems, right? That's from their own insistence that to claim anarchism, also expand it, right? And also own it in a different way.
I had a question. I love how earlier you were talking about the kind of energies that were present amongst the organizers and the work that they're doing in these different spaces. And I think a lot about how what we envision as our future is always tied to like what we can make of our physical space. And so I wonder if there's anything in those spaces that you saw that stood out as kind of symbols of those visions. I know you mentioned arts, but maybe in that and other ways, like how did you think through, you know, how our imagination is tied to our physical place and how people were making those spaces or counter spaces?
That's a great question, and that is something that I tried to, you know, I tried to kind of you know, the spatial layout of some of these spaces as sort of a you know, a lens through which to understand the politics that they were enacting. And I think that they very much did, in many cases, intentionally lay out their spaces in ways that that were in line with the politics, right? And so it's a lot of definitely a lot of the visuals, you know, a lot of, you know, of the, like the rebel aesthetic that I talk about, like the spaces are absolutely represent that and have lots of artwork, but they're also very, very much organized around, you know, communal spaces and and sort of spaces that are functional in helping them achieve their political projects, right? So, you know, communal libraries in their spaces where they have a lot of these anarchist texts and revolutionary texts and science fiction and other kinds of literature that are hard to find and that they want to make readily accessible, you know, sort of community kitchens where people can come and eat, whether or not they're part of the space or not, where folks can bring, you know, food to donate, spaces that can be used to give free workshops. And so just really organized around being open, being communal, but also being very, like, having the politics of it very clear, right? So that it doesn't become sort of this, like, you know, urban farming as a sort of, you know, health choice by itself, right? Like, they understand that we need to feed ourselves to be healthy, but this is also political, right? The fact that we're not buying food, right, and we're actually growing it, or we're exchanging with others, right? That's the point as well, right? It's to eat healthy, but it's also to live healthy relationships, both to the earth and to others, right? And so those kinds of things were very present in these spaces.
Thank you for that, highlighting that at the end, that it's like, it's about the politics. It's also not spaces that maybe us hearing about this can imagine to be like, yes, communal spaces and collective support and everyone has access, but this is also a statement in and of itself, and it's functioning because this is part of what we want, you know, in our society, what we want in terms of how we're working together. It's like how we want to coexist. This is a way.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Do we have time for more questions, or?
Yeah, I think if we take that last question,
Okay.
if you're open to it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, can you talk about Radio Casarola and how that served as a space and modality for women to be present in the narrative of the movement? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's, you know, one of the most important spaces of the movement in the context of the grassroots takeover in 2006. It was, so again, radio was, you know, really important for the movement when it was, you know, when it was the, you know, just the teachers' strike and encampment. The teachers' union has a radio station, and the radio station was really important in informing the teachers as well as the general public about, you know, what was going on, announcing actions and things like that. But as soon as when the teachers were being evicted from the Central Plaza, they were also attacking the teachers' radio station and taking it offline. And so part of the strategy of the movement became, you know, how do we continue to have a presence on the radio in terms of just logistics, right? Informing everybody of what's happening, and you know, sort of for the purpose of internal news and keeping the public aware. But the government and then the paramilitaries were also very aware of that, and so they would take the movement radio off the air. And so without a functioning radio, they really had no way to counter the story, the pro-government story about what was happening, right? And so you know, the governor would be on, you know, the national television news shows, the pundits at the national level being saying that nothing's happening in Oaxaca, or, you know, it's just a few, you know, radical teachers, but, you know, there's nothing to see, we've got it under control. And so then a group of women from the movement decided to split off of one of the marches early in the movement to go to the state-run radio and TV station to demand airtime so that they could tell their side of what was happening, right? They're like, this is a station, we are the public, you're only giving the government side, let us also give our side. And not surprisingly, right, they denied them airtime. And so they decided spot that they were going to take it over, right? So then they took over the state-run TV and radio station, and that became the megaphone and the voice and the organizing mechanism for the movement. And it stayed a space that was run by women, right? And took it over, and women kept control of it, right? They were the ones in front of the camera. They were the ones behind the camera. They were the ones deciding what programming are we going to do? What issues do we think need to be highlighted? So it became this super important part of the movement. It was very explicitly a woman-run space, and they kept it that way, right? And so that became really a way for women to be very visible and heard in the through Radio Cacerola, right? And so that's, you know, it's a really important part of the movement. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you, Dr. Gillam and Dr. Magaña, for your conversation and sharing your knowledge and bringing, your great energies and teachings to all of us. Thank you. And with that, we'll wrap it up unless others have last words that they want to say. And thank you to the audience for attending. We got a thank you from Amina.
Yeah, and thank you all. Thank you to the audience. Thank you again, Reighan, for your really questions and engagement with the book. It's really great to be in conversation with you, and Kathleen and Juan and Amina for your questions and for all the work that went into putting this event on.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, and hope you all have a good weekend.
Thank you.